He walked into that ballroom with another woman on his arm, and every person in that room held their breath. Not for him. For her. Massimo Vescari, the most feared name in American organized crime, smiled at his guests like a man who had just won something. His mistress, Celeste Vaughn, wore a red dress cut low enough to be a statement, her hand curled possessively around his forearm. The chandelier caught her diamonds. Cameras clicked. People whispered. And across the room, Seraphine Vale Vescari stood perfectly still. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for the glass of champagne in her hand. She simply slid her wedding ring off her finger, 12 years of marriage reduced to a quiet click of gold against crystal, and set it beside his untouched glass at the head table. Then she turned and walked out. No scene, no tears, no goodbye. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If you've ever swallowed humiliation in a room full of people who watched it happen, if you've ever had to decide between your dignity and your fury in the space of 3 seconds, then you already know exactly what was moving behind Seraphine's eyes as she walked through those doors. If you're watching this story for the first time, drop your city in the comments right now and hit that like button so I can see how far this has traveled. Because what happens next is the kind of thing people don't believe until it's already over. Subscribe and stay with me until the end. You will not want to miss a single piece of this. The Black Crest Syndicate Gala had been running for 41 years without a single incident. That was the point of it. Neutrality. The marble floors of the Ashford Grand had absorbed decades of handshakes between men who would have happily killed each other in any other setting. The annual gala was the one night everyone agreed to behave, because the alternative, the kind of open war that followed a broken truce, cost more than any family wanted to spend. 41 years. Not one glass thrown. Not one voice raised. Massimo Vescari shattered that record without throwing a single punch. He had arrived 40 minutes late, deliberately, because Massimo believed late arrivals commanded more attention than punctual ones, and he was not wrong. And he had walked through the main entrance with Celeste on his left arm and the smile of a man who had recently decided he no longer owed anyone an explanation. The Della Rosa family had been watching from the east end of the room. Old Marco Della Rosa, 73 years old, a man who had survived 4 attempts on his life and still walked without a cane, had gone very quiet when he saw them enter. His daughter, who was standing beside him, had leaned in and said something low. Marco had shaken his head once. The Callahan contingent, Chicago, said nothing either. They watched. The Voss brothers from the Pacific Coast operation had exchanged a look that could have meant anything. What all of them had understood in that moment, and what Massimo had not, was that this was not simply a man choosing a mistress over a wife. That happened. It was understood to happen. Men in this business made personal disasters of their marriages regularly, and nobody lost sleep over the domestic details. What made the room go cold was who the wife was. Seraphine Vale had not been born into this world. She had arrived in it at 22, the daughter of a mid-level accountant from a small coastal city, brought into Massimo's orbit through a chain of circumstances that Massimo had always described, when he described it at all, as fortunate timing. He had said it so many times and with such casual certainty that he had eventually believed it himself. 12 years. That was how long Seraphine had been at his side, quiet and precise, and almost never in the foreground. She didn't attend the operational meetings. She didn't sit at the main table during negotiations. She was the woman who appeared briefly at formal gatherings, said the right things in the right rooms, and then disappeared back into the routines of a life that, from the outside, looked very much like the life of a powerful man's composed and largely decorative wife. That was the version Massimo had curated. The people in that ballroom, the ones who had actually done business with the Vescari organization at any depth, knew a different version. They knew that when the Pescaro faction had tried to absorb 3 of Massimo's eastern distribution routes 6 years ago, it had been Seraphine who identified the pressure points in their financing structure and quietly communicated them to 2 competing families until Pescaro found themselves under attack from 3 directions simultaneously and had no choice but to retreat. No blood, no war. Massimo had accepted the congratulations for that one. They knew that the Vescari legal infrastructure, the network of shell corporations, real estate fronts, and offshore accounts that made the organization nearly impossible to prosecute, had been designed by a woman who had taught herself international financial law from textbooks ordered through a university library card she'd kept since her early 20s. They knew that when one of Massimo's captains, a man named Drago, had been discovered skimming from the Western accounts 3 years ago, it had been Seraphine who had found the discrepancy in numbers that Massimo's entire financial team had missed. She had said nothing to Massimo directly. She had simply placed a single sheet of paper on his desk one morning with a note that read, "Check the variance in column 7. Drago had been gone within the week. These were not secrets, exactly. They were simply things that nobody had ever said out loud in Massimo's presence, because nobody was certain what would happen if they did. And uncertainty in this business tends to produce silence. So the room had watched Massimo walk in with Celeste Vaughn, and the room had understood something that Massimo had not yet grasped. He had just publicly discarded the most valuable strategic asset in his organization, and she hadn't made a sound. Thus, Seraphine had not planned to remove her ring that night. She had known about Celeste for 4 months. That was not a guess. She had known the precise date it began, the location of the apartment Massimo had quietly leased in the Meridian district, the name of the hotel they had used twice before that. She had known because she had always maintained access to information Massimo assumed flowed only to him, and because 4 months ago she had noticed a particular pattern in his calendar that she recognized immediately. She had not confronted him. She had not called attorneys or contacted allies or done any of the things a woman in her position might have been expected to do. She had waited, partly because she needed to understand what Massimo intended, whether Celeste was a distraction or a direction, and partly because Seraphine had never in her adult life made a decision of consequence while she was still angry. She had been very angry. The anger was not the operatic kind, not the kind that burns hot and demands witnesses. It was the cold, thorough kind that turns itself into productivity. For 4 months she had been extraordinarily productive. What she had not planned was the ring. That had been instinct, the specific, ungovernable kind of instinct that bypasses calculation entirely. She had seen them come through those doors, and something in her had simply said, enough. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. The ring had come off before she fully registered the decision, and she had set it down on the white tablecloth beside his glass with the same precision she applied to everything, and then she had walked. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing she noticed most. Her heels made no sound on the marble because she had never learned to walk any way other than quietly. 12 years in a world where listening carefully was more valuable than speaking loudly had trained certain habits into her body that she doubted she would ever fully undo. She did not look back. She had said goodnight to no one, collected nothing from the coat check, and stepped through the side exit onto the service corridor because it was faster, and because Seraphine Vale Vescari had never seen any reason to perform her exits. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent. A car was waiting, not because she had arranged it in anticipation of that specific moment, but because Seraphine always had a car available, had since the 2nd year of her marriage, when she had realized that depending on Massimo's schedule for her own transportation was a form of containment she refused to accept. The driver, a man named Fenn, who had worked for her privately for 6 years, said nothing when she got in. He had learned that she would speak when she was ready, and that the quality of whatever she was processing in the silence was usually more important than whatever he might offer to interrupt it. She sat in the back and looked at her left hand. The indentation from the ring was still there. A pale ring of habit where the gold had rested for so long, the skin beneath had a slight difference in texture. She pressed her thumb against it. "The warehouse on Carver," she said finally. Fenn pulled into traffic. The warehouse on Carver Street had been a legitimate textile import business before Massimo purchased it 12 years ago as a cover operation. It had stayed a textile import business on paper, and it had actually functioned as one for the first 3 years, because Seraphine had argued that the best cover was one that wasn't entirely hollow. Massimo had thought it was a waste of operational energy to run an actual business. Seraphine had thought that an operation generating real revenue was harder to pull on a thread than one generating only the appearance of it. She had been right. Several of his other fronts had been rolled up by federal investigators over the years. The textile company had never been touched. She hadn't told him that tonight. There were several things she hadn't told him yet. The warehouse had a back office that looked like nothing in particular, and inside it were two people Massimo had never met. The first was a woman named Yara Selkuk, 41, who had worked for 7 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government before Seraphine had made her a different kind of offer. The second was a man named Cato Reyes, who had been one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the Eastern underworld before a disagreement with his previous employer had left him professionally displaced. Neither of them worked for Massimo. Neither of them had ever worked for Massimo. They worked for the network Seraphine had been quietly building for 6 years. Not in opposition to the Vescari organization, but alongside it, invisible to it, constructed piece by piece with the patience of someone who understood that the most durable structures were the ones nobody noticed going up. She had not known 6 years ago that she would need it for this. She had built it anyway, because she had long understood something that Massimo, for all his ruthlessness, had never quite grasped. Power that depends entirely on one person's permission is not power. It is proximity, and proximity can be revoked. Yara was at the desk when Seraphine arrived, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, 3 monitors running. She looked up, read Seraphine's face, and looked back at her screens. "It happened," Yara said. It was not a question. "Tonight." Seraphine dropped her coat over the back of a chair. He brought her to the gala. Cato, who had been standing at the window with a coffee that had long since gone cold, turned around. "In front of everyone," he said. "In front of everyone." Cato set down the coffee. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, the way a man looks when a prediction he made a long time ago turns out to have been accurate, and he takes no particular pleasure in it. "So we move," he said. "We move." Seraphine sat down. She did not look tired, although she was. She looked like someone who has been carrying a heavy piece of furniture for a long time and has just reached the room it belongs in. "Yara, the Castellan accounts." "Ready. The Mercer Street authorization codes." "Rotated. His access was deprecated 2 weeks ago. He doesn't know yet because the interface he uses to check still shows green." Seraphine nodded. She had designed that particular detail herself. The idea that Massimo could believe he still had access to something while actually holding a key that opened nothing. It had felt, at the time, almost too precise. "The offshore sequence? I need 4 hours to complete the final transfer architecture. Once it's done, the accounts exist, the money is real, and none of it is accessible without your biometric and a secondary authorization from one of the commission witnesses." Yara paused. "Not 1 signature. 2. "Good. He's going to find out," Cato said. "The question is when and how loud." "He'll find out in layers," Seraphine said. "That's deliberate. The first thing he discovers will look like a technical glitch. The second will look like bad luck. By the time he understands what's actually happening, it won't matter what he understands." Cato was quiet for a moment. "The captains," he said. 3 of them have already been in contact. Formally, they still serve him. Practically, she left the rest of it where it was. "De La Rosa's people reached out last week," Yara said, without looking up from her screen. Seraphine had already known that, but she let Yara say it because information shared was better than information hoarded, even between people who worked closely together. "Marco De La Rosa has been watching Massimo for 2 years," Seraphine said. "He's been patient because open conflict is expensive, and he's 73 and doesn't want to spend what he has left on a war. But he's been watching." She paused. "He watched tonight." "What did he see?" "He saw Massimo walk into the most politically neutral room in the American underworld and turn it into a personal announcement." She folded her hands on the table. "He saw a man who thinks his position is permanent, making a decision like someone who believes he'll never have to pay for anything." Cato made a sound low in his throat. "And he saw you leave," he said. "Yes." "Without a scene." "Yes." Cato nodded slowly. "That's the part they'll remember." He was right, and she knew it. In a world that respected force above almost everything else, there was a specific kind of power in not using it when everyone expected you to. She had not planned the restraint for effect, but it would have effect. Well, the next morning, Massimo woke in the suite at the Meridian where he and Celeste had stayed, and he felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that functioned almost like relief. He had been preparing for a confrontation for months. He had imagined the scene in various forms, Seraphine's precise, cutting voice, laying out his failures, the lawyers, the calls to her family, such as it was, the particular kind of war that happens inside a marriage before it happens outside one. None of it had come. She had taken the ring off and walked out, and there had been nothing. He told himself this meant she had accepted it. He told himself this while ordering breakfast, and while Celeste laughed at something on her phone, and while the city outside ran through its ordinary morning rhythms below the window. He told himself this with considerable conviction. He was still telling himself this 4 hours later when his director of operations, a careful man named Svek, who had been with the organization for 11 years, knocked on the suite door and told him, without quite meeting his eyes, that there appeared to be a problem with the Castellan accounts. What kind of problem? Svek hesitated in the specific way that people hesitate when they are uncertain whether the information they are delivering is bad enough to survive the delivery. The authorization appears to have lapsed, Svek said. Massimo stared at him. Authorization. The codes that allow our representatives to make withdrawals or transfers above a certain threshold. Svek stopped, restarted. They show as expired. Our people tried to process the scheduled transfer at 9 this morning and the system rejected it. Then get new codes. That's the issue. Svek was choosing his words with the care of a man crossing ice. The system requires the original architect's biometric confirmation to regenerate the authorization sequence. And the original architect... He stopped again. The room was very quiet. Who designed the Castellan architecture? Massimo said. It was not quite a question because somewhere below the level of his certainty, he already knew. Svek said nothing. Massimo felt the first cold thing move through him. He reached for his phone and called Seraphine's number. The line connected on the second ring, but no one spoke. Not silence, exactly. There was the slight texture of an open line, the faint sound of ambient space. Then the line closed. She had picked up and hung up. Not blocked. Not rejected. Picked up, held the phone, and chosen not to speak. Massimo stood at the window of the suite and looked out at the city and felt something shift in him that he did not have a name for yet, some understanding that was trying to reach the surface of his thinking but hadn't quite broken through. It would, though. He would understand it all, eventually. But by then, the second domino would already be falling. The phone sat in Massimo's hand for a long moment after the line closed. He was not a man who got rattled. He had been in rooms where people had tried to rattle him, with weapons, with leverage, with information designed to destabilize, and he had learned early that the worst thing you could do in those moments was let the feeling reach your face. So his face stayed even, and his breathing stayed measured, and Svek stood by the door and waited with the particular stillness of a man who understood that his job right now was to be furniture. Get Drexler on the phone, Massimo said. Drexler was his chief financial architect. Had been for 9 years. A thin, compulsive man from somewhere in the mid-Atlantic corridor who wore the same style of gray suit every single day and who had, in 9 years, never once failed to answer a call within 2 rings. He answered on the 4th. I need you at the Castellan interface in the next 20 minutes, Massimo said. A pause. Not long, but present. I've been looking at it since 7 this morning, Drexler said. And? Another pause. This one longer. Massimo. Drexler's voice had the quality of someone who has decided that the truth is less dangerous than the alternative. I need you to understand something before I explain what I'm seeing. The Castellan architecture, the underlying structure that controls authorization across all 9 accounts. It was not built by anyone on my team. Massimo said nothing. I've been operating within it for 6 years, Drexler continued. I understood my access points. I understood what I could do and where my limits were. I assumed those limits were security features. Standard compartmentalization. He stopped. They weren't security features. They were boundaries. Someone built this system so that the people inside it could never see the full shape of it. Who built it? The silence on Drexler's end lasted long enough that Massimo felt his jaw tighten. I don't know, Drexler said. That's what I'm telling you. I don't know because whoever designed it didn't leave a name anywhere in the architecture. What they left were methods. And the methods... He paused again, and this time when he spoke, something in his voice had changed, something that sounded almost like reluctant admiration. The methods are unlike anything I've encountered. Whoever did this thought 10 years ahead. Massimo set the phone down on the windowsill without ending the call and stared at the city below. Behind him, Celeste came out of the bedroom in a hotel robe, her hair loose, and started to say something about breakfast. She looked at his back and stopped. She had enough instinct, at least, to know when the room had changed temperature. She went back to the bedroom and closed the door quietly. Svek drove him to the operations center on Hollis Avenue, a nondescript building 3 blocks from the river that housed the financial and communications infrastructure of the Vescari organization's eastern operations. Massimo had been there hundreds of times. He knew every hallway, every face, every terminal. He walked in and felt immediately that something was different. It took him a moment to identify what it was. The people at their stations were working. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the specific quality of the work, the way eyes moved a half-second too slowly to their screens when he entered, the way conversations didn't quite stop but dropped in volume by a register that was too deliberate to be accidental. They already knew something. Whatever it was, it had traveled faster than he had. Drexler met him at the central terminal and pulled up the Castellan interface on the primary screen. It looked, to an untrained eye, exactly as it always had. The familiar grid of account identifiers, balance figures, status indicators, all of it green and orderly. Everything looks normal, Massimo said. Everything looks normal, Drexler agreed. That's the problem. He leaned forward and typed a command sequence. A secondary window opened. This is what our access actually controls, these 8 fields. Transfer initiation, balance inquiries, vendor payment processing, and 5 administrative functions that are largely cosmetic. Massimo waited. Drexler typed another sequence. A third window opened, deeper, different in color, denser in structure. This is the actual architecture. 43 functional layers. We have access to 8 of them. He looked at Massimo directly. The remaining 35 require a biometric key that none of us possess. Without access to those layers, we can see the accounts. We cannot move, restructure, close, or renegotiate anything in them. The weight of that settled over Massimo like something physical. How long has it been this way? He said quietly. As far as I can determine? Drexler straightened. From the beginning. Massimo sent 3 calls to Seraphine over the course of the morning. She accepted the second one. You need to come in, he said, keeping his voice calibrated, controlled. He was not going to give her anger. Not yet. I don't work for you, Seraphine said. The simplicity of it landed like a flat stone dropped into still water. You're my wife. I was your wife. A beat. You announced the correction publicly, in front of every significant family in the country. I think we can both agree that particular formality has been addressed. This isn't about last night. There are operational issues that require what? Her voice was even and unhurried. My cooperation, my assistance, my continued investment of time and knowledge in a structure that exists because of me and currently benefits only you? Massimo's hand was tight around the phone. Seraphine, I'm going to give you something for free, she said, because you're going to spend the next several days being given information by people who are afraid of you, and fear produces bad information. So here's something accurate. The organization you believe you control is not the organization that actually exists. You have been operating inside a version of it. The full version has always had a different set of keys. And you have them. I built the locks, she said. Decide for yourself what that means. The call ended. Massimo stood in the operations center with a room full of people pretending not to watch him, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth twice, slowly, and then he said to Svek, very quietly, "Find her." Triumphed. The finding was not simple. Seraphine's primary residence, The Vale Vescari estate on the north end of the city was empty when Massimo's men arrived. Not abandoned, not hastily vacated, cleaned out with precision, the kind of thoroughness that suggested the departure had been planned sometime in advance. Personal items removed. Files gone. The office on the second floor, where Seraphine had spent a significant portion of 12 years, contained nothing but furniture. The woman who cleaned the estate twice a week had been given 6 months of wages in cash, by hand, the previous Thursday. She showed Massimo's men the envelope when they asked. She didn't know where Seraphine had gone. She said this without apparent nervousness, which meant she was either telling the truth or was very good. And Massimo's men were not sure which. The secondary address, an apartment in Seraphine's name near the financial district that Massimo had known about and had always considered a harmless indulgence, was similarly clean. The building superintendent said a woman matching Seraphine's description had visited twice in the past month and had overseen the removal of several boxes. They ran her known vehicles. One appeared on a traffic camera heading east on the Carver overpass at 11:42 p.m. the previous night. Then nothing, as though the city had swallowed her. Svek reported this to Massimo in the late afternoon, and Massimo's response was to pour 2 fingers of whiskey and not drink it. "She's not running," he said finally. Svek said nothing. "If she were running, she'd be gone. Actually gone, out of the country, somewhere she'd calculated we couldn't reach. She's not gone. She's—" He stared at the glass. "She's repositioned." There was a difference, and it mattered. A woman running was a woman in retreat. A woman repositioning had chosen her new ground deliberately and was currently standing on it. The captain's meeting that evening was not what Massimo expected. He had called it as a show of normalcy, a regular operations review that would signal to the organization that nothing had fundamentally changed. 8 captains normally attended. 5 came. The 3 who didn't sent representatives with explanations that were polite and specific and completely unverifiable. Scheduling conflicts, a medical situation, travel delays. Massimo sat at the head of the table and listened to the 5 who were present give their reports, and he read the room the way he had always read rooms. Not from what people said, but from the texture of how they said it. 2 of the 5 were watching him the way you watch a man standing on ice of uncertain thickness. Attentive, waiting to see what gave. One of them, Petra Vance, who ran the Western logistics corridors and who had been with the organization for 14 years, was watching him with something that was not quite worry and not quite calculation, but occupied the uncomfortable space between the two. "Petra," he said, cutting across the report she was delivering, "the 3 who didn't come." She met his eyes without flinching, which was one of the things he had always respected about her. "They're being careful," she said. "Careful. There are conversations happening outside this room, Massimo. You know that." "What kind of conversations?" She looked at him steadily. "The kind that happen when people aren't sure which direction something is falling." The other 4 at the table were very still. Massimo let that sit for a moment. "And which direction do you think it's falling, Petra?" "I think," she said carefully, "that depends on what you do in the next 48 hours. It was not the answer he wanted. It was, however, probably the most honest thing said in that room, in a considerable amount of time. The intelligence came in pieces over the following 36 hours, and each piece was worse than the one before it. The weapons pipeline through the Calvert distribution network went quiet without explanation. 3 scheduled transfers simply didn't arrive. When Svek sent people to the Calvert warehouse to investigate, they found the operation running normally, the staff present, no signs of disruption. The logistics manager said the transfers had been rerouted per standard authorization. He had the paperwork. The authorization codes were legitimate. They traced the authorization. It linked back to a security architecture that Drexler had never seen before, one that appeared to have been embedded within the normal system for at least 2 years. A shadow layer with its own authorization chain, and at the top of that chain— "She designed this before she knew she'd need it," Drexler said. His voice had gone quiet with something that wasn't admiration anymore. It was closer to unease. "This rerouting infrastructure was built 18 months ago. The trigger conditions were set then. She just activated them." Massimo sat in the chair across from Drexler's terminal and said nothing. "The trigger conditions," he said after a while. "What were they?" Drexler pulled up the code, translated the logic for him. The rerouting protocols activated automatically under two conditions. First, if Seraphine's biometric access was not confirmed within the system within a rolling 30-day period. Second, if a specific flag within the Gala security log system registered that she had exited the Ashford Grand before 11 p.m. on a night when Massimo was present. She had built an automated response to her own exit. She had known, or planned for, the possibility of last night, 18 months before last night happened. Massimo looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "Where is her mentor?" The mentor's name was Aldrich Fenn, and he was 77 years old and had been, in his working life, one of the most precise legal minds in the northeastern organized crime world. He had retired to a house on a small property outside the city, where he grew tomatoes badly and read contract law for what he claimed was pleasure. Seraphine had worked with him from the very beginning of her involvement with the Vescari organization. He had taught her things she'd never been taught, and she had, over the years, returned the visits and the conversations as something that looked from the outside very much like genuine affection. Massimo had always found Fenn harmless, old, peripheral. He sent 2 men to the property at 6 in the morning. Fenn was there. He answered the door in a cardigan that had seen better years, blinked at the 2 men on his porch with mild curiosity, and when they told him he needed to come with them, he said only, "Will this take long? I have bread in the oven." They brought him to a secure location on the south side, a facility Massimo used for sensitive conversations, a place where the furniture was uncomfortable on purpose. Massimo arrived 2 hours later. He sat across from Fenn at a table and looked at the old man, who looked back at him with an expression of polite inconvenience, as though he had been asked to change his dinner reservation. "Where is she?" Massimo said. "I genuinely don't know," Fenn said. "You're her closest contact outside the organization. I'm an old man she has dinner with sometimes. I'm not her operations coordinator." He folded his hands on the table. The hands were spotted and slightly swollen at the knuckles and entirely steady. "Massimo, I've known you for 11 years. I'm going to tell you something as plainly as I'm capable of, and I hope you hear it in the spirit it's offered." He paused. "You're trying to locate a woman by looking in the places she used to be. She is not in any of those places because she is not the same person she was when she occupied them. You're also trying to understand what she's doing by using the logic of how you would respond in her position. That framework is not going to serve you." Massimo said nothing. "She thinks differently than you," Fenn said. "She always has. You knew that. You used to value it. The question is what you do with the understanding now that you've turned it against yourself." He said it without heat, without performance, the way a man states something he has believed for a long time and sees no point in softening. Massimo looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to stay here for a while," he said. Fenn sighed. "I thought that might be the direction. My bread is going to burn." By the time Massimo returned to Hollis Avenue, the political calls had started failing. 3 of them. 3 contacts in the regulatory and law enforcement structure who had, for years, provided the Vescari organization with advance notice of investigations, warrants, and coordinated pressure campaigns. Each of them had been managed through a specific communication protocol that routed through a switchboard architecture that, Drexler now confirmed, with the effect of a man delivering increasingly bad news from an increasingly long list, was also built by Seraphine. The switchboard still worked. The contacts, however, were not returning calls, not blocked, not hostile, simply unavailable. Svek put it plainly. Someone reached them first. "With what?" Massimo said. "I don't know. But 3 of them going silent in the same 12-hour window isn't coincidence." Celeste, who had been present for more of these conversations than she should have been, said from across the room, "Maybe someone inside is leaking. Someone who knows who those contacts are and how to approach them." The room registered the comment in the way rooms register things said by people who should not be speaking. A controlled non-response that was itself a kind of response. Massimo looked at her. She held his gaze and said, "I'm just saying, the timing is specific. Whoever is moving against you knows the exact pressure points." She was not wrong about that. What she didn't say because she did not know it, was that among the organizations known to have recently received briefings from a private intelligence intermediary about the internal structure of the Vescari operation, briefings that contained specific information about regulatory contacts, financial architecture, and personnel, were no fewer than 4 rival families and the Valmont Commission itself. The Commission. The body that existed precisely for situations like this one. That particular piece of information reached Massimo at 9 p.m. through a contact he trusted more than most, and it hit him the way cold water hits a man who thinks he's dreaming. The Valmont Commission had received a briefing. The Commission didn't act without reason, and it didn't receive briefings unless someone with standing to give them had requested its attention. Only someone with standing inside the American organized crime structure could do that. And standing was not purchased or inherited. It was recognized. He stood in his operations center and understood, with the specific clarity that comes at the end of a long sequence of understandings, that Seraphine had not simply left him. She had gone somewhere. She had gone to the table that sat above every other table in this world, and she had taken something with her. And every intelligence failure, every frozen account, every missing captain and silent phone line in the past 36 hours had not been the opening of an attack. It had been preparation. She hadn't been destroying the empire. She had been deciding who deserved to inherit it. Massimo felt the full shape of it finally, felt it the way you feel the ground shift before you hear the sound. And he understood then that he was no longer standing on solid ground at all, that he had not been standing on solid ground for a very long time, had been standing instead on something she had built beneath him, something she had just, very quietly, begun to remove. Massimo didn't sleep. He sat in the operations center at Hollis Avenue until 2 in the morning, and then until 3. And the building emptied around him one person at a time until it was only him and Svek and one of the overnight communications techs who kept his eyes on his screen with the focused dedication of a man who understood that invisibility was the safest available option. The whiskey was still on the table, still untouched. Massimo was not a man who drank when he was afraid. He was a man who went very still. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, and his breathing was even, and if you had walked into that room without knowing him, you might have thought he was calm. Svek knew him. Svek was not fooled. "The commission meeting," Massimo said finally. "When?" "My contact says it's already been convened, informally at this stage, but the formal session..." Svek checked his phone. "Possibly within the week." "Who requested it?" Svek didn't answer immediately. "Who?" Massimo said again, quieter. "The request came through a standing member with full right of petition." Svek set the phone face down on the table. "They're not releasing the petitioner's name until the formal session. That's commission protocol." "It's her." "That's my assessment. Yes." Massimo pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and held them there. The Valmont Commission did not get involved in marital disputes. It did not adjudicate personal grievances or organizational restructurings or the ordinary violence of men rearranging their professional relationships. It existed for one purpose only: to intervene when a member organization's behavior threatened the stability of the broader structure. When the cost of inaction exceeded the cost of action, for the commission to convene, someone had to have made a case. Not an emotional case. Not a wounded wife's complaint. A documented, evidenced, structurally argued case that the Vescari organization, under Massimo's current leadership, represented an active threat to the equilibrium that kept all of them functional. That kind of case took time to build. 18 months, perhaps. Massimo lowered his hand and looked at the wall. "She's been building this since before the gala," he said. "Yes." "The gala wasn't the trigger. The gala was..." He stopped. "The gala was the deadline. She had a window, and she chose the date. That's what the architecture suggests." He sat with that. The thing about Seraphine that he had always understood and had apparently failed to take seriously enough was that she did not act without a full picture. She had never made a move not in 12 years, that she had not thought past the ending of. Other people planned to the point of action. She planned past it, to the consequences of the consequences, and she built contingencies for those. He had watched her do it. He had valued it when it served him. He had just never looked directly at it, had never turned his full attention to the question of what that mind might produce if it turned itself on him. He was looking now. The first safe house raid happened at 5 in the morning. Massimo had identified 3 locations where Seraphine might have established operational infrastructure. He sent teams to all 3 simultaneously, because she would anticipate sequential searches and could redirect between them, but simultaneous pressure would be harder to evade. The first location, a commercial property in the warehouse district, was empty, not recently vacated, cleared weeks ago, down to the electrical fixtures. The second, a residential building with a basement unit that had been leased under a corporate name tracing back through 3 holding entities to a company that no longer technically existed, contained furniture, 2 inactive computers wiped to factory settings, and a coffee mug on the kitchen counter that was still faintly warm. Svek called him from the second location. "She was here," he said. "Not long ago." "How long?" "Hour, maybe less." Someone had tipped her. Had to have been. The only other explanation was that she had active surveillance on her own former locations and had moved the moment she registered the teams departing Hollis Avenue, which required either a source inside his operation or a level of monitoring infrastructure he hadn't known she possessed. Neither option was comfortable. The third location was a law office that Massimo's team arrived at to find occupied by a sitting attorney, 3 support staff, and 2 clients who had legitimate morning appointments and were extremely unhappy about the interruption. The building had housed a legitimate practice for 11 years. If it had ever served any other function, there was no trace of it. Massimo received the 3 reports in sequence within 40 minutes and understood that she had known about all 3 locations and had addressed each one differently. The first she had abandoned long ago, the second she had evacuated within the past hour. The third had never been what he thought it was. 3 different responses to 3 different situations she had anticipated he would construct. She was not evading him. She was demonstrating that she could. Celeste called at 7. Massimo didn't answer. She called again at 7:15 and he picked up because ignoring it was no longer a productive use of his energy. "You need to come back," she said. Her voice had the particular edge of someone who has been managing anxiety by converting it to irritation. "There are people here. 2 men from the Callahan operation in Chicago. They're saying they need to speak with you directly, and they won't talk to anyone else." The Callahans. Chicago. The family that had watched him walk into the gala and said nothing. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. The 2 men from the Callahan operation were named Breck and Sorrell, and they were the kind of men who communicated primarily through stillness and the deliberate economy of their movements. They were waiting in the main sitting room of the Meridian Suite when Massimo arrived, both of them standing rather than sitting, which was itself a communication. Standing meant they were not planning to stay. "The Callahan family extends its regards," the one named Breck said. He had a flat, broad face and small, attentive eyes, and asked me to deliver a message directly. "Then deliver it," Massimo said. "The Callahan family will not be attending any commission session that includes testimony regarding the Vescari organization's internal administration." He paused. "Unless the session proceeds to a formal vote on standing. In that case, they will attend and their position will be determined by the evidence presented." Massimo parsed this carefully. "They're not supporting me," he said. "They're not opposing you. At this time." Breck's delivery was entirely without inflection. "The family asks that you understand the distinction." Celeste was standing near the window. Massimo could feel her attention on the conversation the way you feel a draft from a door that hasn't been fully closed. "And the other families," Massimo said. "Do you carry similar messages from any of them?" "I carry this message. Other families send their own." After they left, Celeste said, "That's neutrality. They're waiting to see what sticks." Massimo looked at her. She had good instincts. He had known that when he'd chosen her. She read rooms accurately, and she understood leverage in the social, performative sense that made her effective at the specific functions he'd needed her for. He was beginning to understand with a clarity that the last 72 hours had sharpened considerably. Someone who did not fully grasp the difference between reading a situation and controlling one. "Yes, Zayas," he said. "That's neutrality. So you need to move before the commission session. Create a fact on the ground that makes their decision easy." "What fact?" "Bring her in." She said it simply, as if it were the obvious move. If she's not free to testify, there's no session. The evidence she's been building disappears. The families that are waiting see you act decisively and they get off the fence. She looked at him directly. You know where she is, or you can find out. Massimo was quiet for a moment. He walked to the window and stood where she had been standing. The city was fully awake now, moving in its morning patterns. Trucks, people, the ordinary density of lives being conducted without any awareness of what was happening in the rooms above them. He thought about Celeste's logic. It was not wrong, exactly. The pressure points she had identified were real. The commission session was the clock he was working against, and disrupting Seraphine's ability to testify would disrupt the session. What Celeste hadn't accounted for, because she didn't know enough too, was what would happen if he moved against Seraphine directly and failed, or succeeded in a way that the commission interpreted as a violation of petition protections. A petitioner before the commission had implied protections. Acting against one was the kind of thing that turned neutral families into active opposition. It was also the kind of thing Seraphine would have anticipated, which meant if there was an obvious move here, she had already built a response to it. He turned away from the window. I need to know everything that's moved through your communications in the last 6 days, he said to Celeste. She blinked. What? Your phone, your messages, everything. She stared at him. You think I think someone inside this operation has been feeding information outward, and I am eliminating possibilities. He held out his hand. Give me the phone. She handed it to him. He watched her face while she did it, watched for the specific micro-expressions that accompany handing over a device you know contains something, the almost imperceptible stiffening, the eyes that move slightly to the wrong place. He didn't see any of it. Her expression was injured, which was probably genuine. Celeste's vanity was real. He gave the phone to Svek, who would have someone go through it properly. The intelligence chief's name was Borek, and he came to Massimo at noon with a folder and the expression of a man who had reviewed his own health insurance recently. He placed the folder on the table between them and did not open it. I need to preface this, Borek said. Don't. Massimo, open the folder and tell me what it says. Borek opened the folder. What it contained was the product of 3 days of intensive internal investigation, the complete audit of financial architecture, communication logs, and operational records going back 12 years that Borak's team had been able to access, the complete record of what Seraphine had actually built inside the Vescari organization, rendered visible now that the need to understand it had finally made the looking thorough enough. Borak walked him through it, the financial architecture, 43 layers as Drexler had identified, and what those layers actually contained. Not just authorization controls, but a complete parallel record of every transaction, every contract, every political payment and liability and leveraged position the organization had accumulated in 12 years. A shadow ledger so complete it functioned as its own archive. The legal infrastructure, the shell corporations, the real estate fronts, the offshore sequencing, all of it designed from first principles by a woman who had taught herself international finance from library books and had then built something that Borak's contacts in the federal investigation world told him they had never been able to fully map. Because the map kept changing, because the system was designed to evolve, because whoever had built it had embedded adaptation directly into the architecture. The intelligence networks. This was the part that sat differently than the rest. Borak turned to a section of the folder that contained a series of contact lists with annotations. Over the course of 12 years, he said, Seraphine maintained direct contact, not through the organization's channels, through private channels we were not aware of, with representatives of 11 of the 14 major families operating in the American structure. He paused. The contacts were not adversarial. They were, the best word I have is collegial. She exchanged information, analysis. On several occasions, early warning of situations that would have produced significant conflict. Massimo was very still. She warned other families. She warned all parties in the situations I'm describing. Borak stopped and started again. There's a situation documented here from 6 years ago. The Pescaro faction moved against your eastern routes. You successfully repelled them. Three families were simultaneously applying pressure on Pescaro's financing. He looked up. That was not coincidence. That was coordinated. And the coordination was her. Yes, but it was also Massimo. She contacted Pescaro first. She gave them a private warning that the move would fail before it began. They didn't take it. The conflict that followed cost them significantly. The families that applied pressure on their financing did so because she had made the case to them that Pescaro's move threatened route stability that affected all of them. He closed the folder. She prevented a war, not by taking sides, by making every side understand that the alternative was more expensive. Massimo looked at the closed folder. How many people knew she was doing this? Among the families? Most of the principals, I think. The people she was in contact with were not low level. Borak's voice was carefully neutral. Among your own captains? Petra Vance? Possibly two others. They understood that Seraphine had relationships outside the organization and that those relationships had value. I don't believe any of them fully grasped the scope. The scope. 12 years. Every major family. A private intelligence and mediation function operating inside the structure of the Vescari organization, invisible to its ostensible leader, preventing conflicts he had never known were coming, building relationships he had never known existed, accumulating the kind of standing that could walk into a commission petition and have it taken seriously before she had spoken a single word. She hadn't been his wife. She had been the thing underneath him that kept the whole structure from falling through. He had thought he was feared. He had not thought about what fear actually bought versus what she had been quietly purchasing with 12 years of precision. Borak said carefully, "There's one more thing." Massimo waited. The night you were installed as head of the Vescari organization, 14 years ago. Borak opened the folder to the last section. There were 4 internal factions that opposed your succession. 2 of them were in direct communication with external interests that would have moved against you within your first year. The intelligence on those communications, the intelligence that allowed your security to get ahead of those threats and neutralize them, came from a source that was never formally identified. The room was entirely silent. It was her, Massimo said. The communication logs are consistent with her methods. The timing matches a period when she would have had access to the relevant channels. I believe, yes. She identified the threats before your security apparatus knew they existed, and she fed the intelligence in a form that let your team act on it without knowing the source. Borak closed the folder for the final time. You did not consolidate the Vescari throne, Massimo. Someone cleared the path for you to walk onto it unopposed, and then they stood behind you for 12 years and kept clearing it. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Massimo sat in it. He had spent 14 years believing in a version of himself that apparently required a ghost to maintain it. A ghost who had made herself invisible because visibility would have required acknowledgement, and he was not a man who acknowledged things that didn't originate with him. She had known that, had understood it the way you understand a landscape you've lived in for a long time. Not as a criticism, just as the terrain. And she had worked with the terrain until she didn't. His hands, still flat on the table, pressed down slowly. The knuckles whitened slightly. He watched them as if they belonged to someone else. Where? He said. The word came out scraped clean of everything. We have a lead on a location in the Eastern District, Borak said. Commercial property. The surveillance team is... The alert came through on Svek's phone simultaneously with Borak's, and then on the operations communications board, all of them at once. The kind of simultaneous notification that means the information is no longer arriving in sequence because it has reached a threshold where the system can no longer queue it. Svek looked at his screen. Something moved in his face that Massimo had not seen there before. What? Massimo said. A broadcast. Svek turned the screen toward him. 40 minutes ago. Distributed to all 14 commission families and their intelligence contacts simultaneously. Documentation package. Massimo took the phone. The documentation package was extensive, clean, organized, forensically precise in the way that Drexler organized financial data and Borak organized intelligence, but filtered through a methodology that was neither of theirs. It contained financial records, the real ones from the shadow ledger, not the operational surface, along with communication logs, payment records, and a detailed accounting of 11 specific violations of commission codes committed by Vescari organization personnel under Massimo's direction over the past 8 years. Not old violations, not technicalities, substantive ones, the kind that the Commission's charter existed to adjudicate, the kind that transferred personal responsibility to the organizational head. At the bottom of the package, a single line. Submitted under petition provisions, Article 7, Commission Charter. Petitioner available for formal session at Commission convening. Massimo set the phone down. She broadcast it, Svek said. Not to us. She didn't send this to us at all. She sent it to everyone else simultaneously, so that by the time we had it, 14 families and the Commission Secretariat already had it, and there was nothing. He stopped. Nothing to intercept, nothing to suppress, nothing to contain. The information was already everywhere it needed to be. Across the table, Borak was reading something on his own screen. Fen, he said quietly. Massimo looked at him. The Commission's emergency provisions. Borak looked up. If a petitioner can demonstrate that a material witness is being held under coercive conditions by the subject of a petition, the Commission can invoke emergency session jurisdiction. They can compel attendance, compel testimony, compel the release of the witness. He set the phone down. They just invoked it. 3 families co-signed the emergency provision within the last 20 minutes. They want Fen released. The last card. Aldrich Fen, held in the Southside facility, who Massimo had taken because he needed leverage, and who had instead become the thing that handed the Commission the procedural authority to act immediately rather than waiting for a formal session. She had known he would take Fen. She had built the response to it before he'd made the move. Massimo stood up from the table, and for a moment he simply stood there. And the thing that moved through him was not anger exactly, though anger was in it. It was the specific and disorienting sensation of understanding, fully and without refuge, that you have been playing a game whose rules you never actually knew. He had been moving pieces on a board. She had been designing the board. He looked at Svek, and his voice, when it came, was flat and stripped to its most basic function. "Release Fen," he said. "Now, send him home." He turned toward the door. "And get me a car. I'm going to the estate. The estate has been—" "I know what the estate is." He didn't turn around. "Get me the car." He was done moving pieces. The car moved through the city in the gray morning light, and Massimo sat in the back and did not speak. Svek was in the front passenger seat. The driver was a man named Kerr, who had been driving for the organization for 7 years, and who understood, by the specific quality of the silence behind him, that this was not a morning for the radio. The estate was 20 minutes out of the city center, up through the hillside neighborhoods where the houses got farther apart, and the trees got closer together, and the light came through at angles that made everything look older than it was. Massimo had bought it in the 2nd year of his leadership because it communicated permanence. Stone walls, iron gates, the kind of architecture that said its occupant expected to be here for a long time. He watched the city fall away behind the window and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, and the 2 states coexisted in him the way they had learned to coexist over a life that had required him to be calm precisely when calm was least natural. He was not calm. He was containing something at significant cost, and the cost was visible in the set of his jaw, and in the flatness behind his eyes, and in the way his right hand rested on his thigh, with the fingers slightly too deliberate to be relaxed. The gates were open when they arrived. Massimo registered this before anything else. The gates were on a coded lock system, and they were standing fully open, not forced, the mechanism intact, just released. Someone had opened them from the inside. Kerr slowed the car. "Keep moving," Massimo said. They went through. The driveway was long and curved, lined with trees that Seraphine had chosen and planted in the 3rd year, and as the car came around the final curve and the house resolved into view, Massimo saw the vehicles, 7 of them, black, varied makes, the kind of anonymous quality fleet that carried people who understood the value of not being remembered. Parked in a loose arrangement in front of the main entrance as though their owners had arrived without coordination, which meant they had arrived with considerable coordination. Massimo looked at the vehicles and felt the thing he was containing shift and tighten. He knew those vehicles, not individually, not the specific cars, but the type, The particular institutional anonymity of them, the deliberate absence of distinguishing marks that was itself the most distinguishing mark possible. Commission vehicles. He counted 7. 7 families, minimum. "Stop the car," he said. Kerr stopped. The 3 of them sat in the stopped car in the driveway of Massimo's estate and looked at the vehicles and the open front door of the house that had been emptied of Seraphine 4 days ago and was now apparently occupied by most of the significant power in the American organized crime world. Svek turned in the passenger seat. His face said something his mouth didn't. Massimo got out of the car. He walked through his own front door without knocking, because it was his door, and the entry hall was empty, and the sound of voices was coming from the formal dining room, which was at the end of the main corridor. He walked the corridor. His footsteps on the stone floor were the loudest sound in the building. Everything else had a muffled, waiting quality, the specific stillness of rooms occupied by people who have agreed to be still. He pushed open the dining room door. The long table, his table, the one he had sat at the head of for 11 years, was fully occupied. Not by his captains. Marco Della Rosa sat at the far end, hands folded, the face of a man who has been somewhere difficult before and returned. Beside him, 2 members of the Della Rosa family council, both older, both watching the door. The Callahan representative, not the 2 men who had come to the hotel, but the senior figure himself, a woman named Harriet Callahan, who ran the Chicago operation with the affect of a retired schoolteacher and the actual temperament of something considerably less forgiving. The Voss brothers, both of them, which was unusual because they rarely appeared in the same room outside their own territory. 3 more figures Massimo recognized from the outer edges of commission proceedings. Neutral parties, adjudicators, the kind of people who showed up when the commission was not suggesting but deciding. At the side of the table, not at the head, not performing the position she had just reclaimed, sat Seraphine. She wore gray. Her hair was pulled back the way it always was when she was working. She had a glass of water in front of her and a folder, and she looked, when Massimo came through the door, exactly the way she had looked every morning of their 12 years together, composed and interior and entirely present in a way that made the air around her feel slightly more organized than the air in the rest of the room. She looked at him the way you look at something you have expected. Marco Della Rosa rose first, then the others, one by one, unhurried, in the manner of people performing something that has been agreed upon in advance, not for theater, but because the form of it mattered to them, had always mattered in this world where form and substance were not as separate as outsiders assumed. They did not rise for Massimo. He understood this in the first second. Understood it the way you understand a blow before it lands. The air moving, the angle of it, the specific character of impact still incoming, but already legible. They rose for her. For Seraphine Vale, who had apparently been in this room before he arrived, who had apparently received these men and this woman as though the estate were hers to receive them in, which Massimo felt the cold understanding of it move through him. It functionally was, had perhaps always functionally been, in the way that things belong to the people who build them rather than the people who occupy them. Nobody drew a weapon. Nobody needed to. Massimo stood in the doorway of his own dining room and looked at the table full of power that was looking back at him. And Seraphine sat at the side and watched his face, and the room waited. He walked in. He did not take the head of the table. There was someone already in that chair, one of the commission adjudicators, an older man named Prest, who Massimo had seen at formal proceedings twice, and who now sat with the stillness of someone exercising institutional authority. Massimo took an empty chair at the long side of the table, across from 2 Della Rosa council members, and he sat down, and he put his hands flat on the table surface, and he said to the room, "All right." Press looked at him for a moment. "Massimo Vescari," he said, "you've been asked to attend this session as the subject of a formal commission petition. Your attendance confirms your acknowledgement that the petition has been received and that you are subject to commission review." He paused. "Do you acknowledge?" Every cell in Massimo's body wanted to say something other than yes. He said, "I acknowledge." The session ran for 2 hours. What happened in those 2 hours was not a trial in any legal sense. There were no lawyers and no formalized procedure, and no rights of the kind that civilian courts concern themselves with. What there was the presentation of documented evidence before witnesses with the standing to evaluate it, followed by questions that the subject of the petition was expected to answer directly, followed by a period of deliberation that happened quietly among people who had been doing this for decades. Seraphine presented the documentation herself. She stood at the side of the table and walked through it section by section in a voice that was even and unhurried and entirely without performance, the voice of someone who has organized this information so many times in her own mind that presenting it has become the least demanding part of the process. The financial records first, the shell structures, the coded movements, the specific transactions that crossed from sophisticated financial engineering into the territory of commission code violations, fraud against partner families specifically, money moved through joint ventures that had been structured so that Vescari interests extracted value that should have been distributed among contributing families. Massimo watched the faces around the table as she presented the financial section. Harriet Callahan's expression didn't change. The Voss brothers exchanged one look. Marco Della Rosa's mouth was a straight line. Then the political payments, the regulatory contacts, the law enforcement relationships, the ways in which Massimo had used information obtained through commission-sanctioned intelligence sharing to build personal political protection that was explicitly prohibited under the neutrality provisions of Commission Charter. Then the incident files. 11 specific situations over 8 years, each documented with communications, financial records, and in several cases corroborating testimony from people who had chosen to provide it. Massimo sat through all of it with his hands flat on the table and his face doing the thing his face knew how to do, which was reveal nothing, and the effort of that was considerable because what was being laid out in front of him was not just evidence of violations. It was evidence that she had been watching, not building a case in the way you build something in anticipation, watching in the way you watch something you are still hoping will change. 12 years of documentation was not the work of someone who had decided to destroy him and then waited. It was the work of someone who had stayed, who had kept building and hoping and watching, and who had recorded everything because the recorder in her could not be turned off, and who had eventually looked at everything she had recorded and made a decision. The decision had not been made at the gala. He understood that now. The gala had been the announcement. The decision had been made somewhere in the 18 months of architectural preparation, in one of the quiet moments between the documents and the accounts and the meetings she had been having with the people now sitting at this table. Prest asked her, at one point, what outcome she was seeking. Seraphine said, without hesitation, "Structural review. The organization remains. The leadership changes. The protocols that were violated are formalized so that future violations carry automatic commission response. Not destruction. Reform." Marco Della Rosa, who had been silent through most of the session, said, "You're not asking for dissolution of the Vescari operation." "No," Seraphine said. "The operation is legitimate and serves stability functions in the Eastern structure. It should continue, under competent administration." "Under yours," Massimo said. He said it flatly, without accusation or question, and the room went very slightly quieter. Seraphine looked at him directly. "Under governance that the Commission can verify," she said. "I am willing to serve in that capacity. I'm also willing to step aside if the Commission identifies another candidate." "But you're available." "I'm available." He held her gaze. She held his. 12 years of knowing each other's faces, operating in a room full of people neither of them was performing for. He looked away first. The deliberation happened in the library. The commission principals and adjudicators withdrew for 30 minutes. Massimo remained in the dining room with Svek, who had been permitted to stay as organizational witness, and with two of his captains who had arrived, summoned by someone, not by him, and who sat at the far end of the table and did not speak to him. One of them was Petra Vance. She met his eyes once, briefly, and what he saw there was not triumph, was not satisfaction, was something closer to the expression of a person who has watched a structural failure they predicted and finds no pleasure in the accuracy. He respected that, in a distant, dissociated way. Respect was still functioning in him even while most of the other mechanisms were under considerable strain. Celeste called during the deliberation. He rejected it. She called again. He turned the phone over. After the third attempt, Svek's phone buzzed. He looked at it. She's trying to access the secondary account she uses for operational expenses. And? It's showing an authorization error. Massimo said nothing. He had not authorized any freeze on Celeste's accounts. He didn't have the authority currently to authorize much of anything, which meant the freeze had come from somewhere in the Castellan architecture, triggered by a condition he hadn't known existed. He thought about what Yara had said, in a conversation he hadn't been part of, but that Borak had partially reconstructed through the investigation. The offshore sequence, 2 biometrics, 2 authorizations. Seraphine's system had apparently identified Celeste's account activity as falling within a category that required secondary authorization, and secondary authorization was now, at minimum, complicated. He sat with the understanding of that. Then the library door opened and the commission principals came back. Press stood at the head of the table. He didn't make it long. The commission finds sufficient evidence of material code violations under Articles 4, 7, and 12 of the Standing Charter. His voice was the institutional voice, not cold, not warm, just the temperature of formal conclusion. Under these findings, the Commission exercises its authority to recommend leadership transition within the Vescari organization, effective upon the organization's structural compliance review. He looked at Massimo. Your title and operational authority are suspended pending that review. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Massimo felt them the way you feel a door closing in a room you've lived in for a long time. The soft, final click of it, the way the air changes. The Commission recognizes Seraphine Vale as interim administrative head of the Vescari organization, with full authority to conduct the structural compliance review and report to the Commission within 60 days. Press looked at her. She nodded once. The Commission further notes that the petitioner's conduct in preparing and presenting this case demonstrates a quality of institutional reasoning that this body has rarely encountered, that is noted formally in the record. Marco Della Rosa said, without rising, seconded. Harriet Callahan said, agreed. The Voss brothers said nothing, which was, for them, affirmation. Massimo sat. He looked at his hands on the table. They were still flat, still controlled. He had not lost control of his hands once through 2 hours of watching his own life disassembled with forensic precision by the woman who had built the most significant parts of it. He was aware of Seraphine across the table. Aware of her the way you're aware of the specific gravity of a room's center, he said, to no one in particular, and then to her because she was the only person in the room who it actually needed to be said to. You should have told me. The room absorbed this. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. I did, she said quietly. 3 years ago, in the office, on a Tuesday, I told you the structure was being compromised from inside and that we needed to review the authorization architecture. She paused. You told me to let Drexler handle it, and then you took a call. He had no memory of this, which was, he understood in the specific silence following her words, probably the most damning thing that had happened in the entire session. Not the documents, not the evidence, not the Commission's finding, the simple fact that she had tried to tell him and he had taken a call and he had no memory of the conversation. The room let that sit. And then Massimo Vescari did something that none of the people in that room had ever seen him do. He stood up. Not in anger, not in the prelude to anything. He just stood up and he straightened his jacket and he looked at the Commission adjudicator and said, I'll cooperate with the structural review. And then he walked to the door. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. His back was to the room, to the table, to 12 years of a life that had just been formally redistributed. Celeste, he said, whatever she has in the secondary accounts. Let her keep it. No one responded. He walked out. He was halfway down the corridor when he heard the footstep behind him. One set. The specific cadence of someone who walked very quietly and had always walked quietly and would probably walk quietly for the rest of her life because the habit was too deep to unlearn. He stopped. He didn't turn around. Seraphine stopped a few feet behind him. He could feel the distance between them, the exact specific distance that exists between two people who know each other completely and are standing on opposite sides of something they cannot uncross. The Mercer accounts, he said. The ones I set up before you were involved. Before any of this. I know about them, she said. I know you know. A beat. I'm not asking you to give them back. I'm asking... He stopped. Started again. There's one account, separate from everything. I put it together for... It was supposed to be for something else. Before. He couldn't finish the sentence the way he'd started it. A pause. The Linzer account, she said. He turned around then. She was exactly where he'd known she was. 7 feet behind him in the corridor, in the gray dress, her hands at her sides. You know about the Linzer account, he said. I've known about it for 4 years. He looked at her face. Looked at it the way he'd looked at it across 14 years, and the specific way that was different from how he'd looked at it across those years. The way that you look at something when you finally know what you're looking at. Then you know what it's for, he said. I know what it was for, she said. Whether it still is. She didn't finish. He looked at her for a long moment. In the corridor of the house he had bought to say permanent, with commission adjudicators behind one door and the remainder of his operational life being quietly distributed among people who had already decided they could manage without him. Did you ever... He stopped. The question was there, but the architecture for it was not. After 14 years, he didn't know how to ask the thing he was trying to ask. Seraphine looked at him with the expression of someone who has carried a very specific kind of exhaustion for a very long time and has only recently put it down. Yes, she said, answering the question he hadn't finished. For a long time. He nodded. Once. The same way she had nodded when Prest confirmed her authority. The Linzer account, he said. I'm not touching it. I don't want it. It was... He looked at the floor and then back at her. It was for something that doesn't exist anymore. Use it for the review. Use it for whatever the organization needs. I don't care. She was quiet. Massimo, she said. He waited. I didn't do this to destroy you. I know, he said. I did it because... I know, he said again. Quieter this time. He turned and walked toward the front door, and his footsteps on the stone floor were the only sound in the corridor, and they were steady. And when he reached the door and pushed through it into the gray morning outside, the estate's old trees stood exactly where they had always stood, unchanged, indifferent, rooted to a ground that had belonged, apparently, to the person who had chosen and planted them. The car was still in the drive, Kerr behind the wheel. Svek coming out behind him a moment later, reading his face, saying nothing. Massimo got in. They sat for a moment without moving. Inside the estate, through the tall front windows, he could see movement. The commission principals beginning the procedural work that followed a finding. Seraphine crossing the entry hall with the folder under her arm, already in motion, already at the thing that came next. She moved like someone who had been waiting to move. Where? Kerr said. Massimo looked at the windows. Anywhere, he said. And Kerr pulled down the drive toward the open gates, and the house grew smaller in the rear window, and the morning opened in front of them gray and without particular direction. And Massimo sat in the back of the car with his hands on his thighs and looked at the road ahead and felt the full weight of what he had just walked out of settle onto him. The way weight settles when you stop fighting it, complete and absolute and almost in its completeness, something approaching rest. But across the city, in a phone that had gone unanswered for 3 hours, Celeste's messages were stacking up with an urgency that had crossed from anxiety into something raw. And in one of them, the one she had sent at 9:47 a.m. before the commission session concluded, before she had known how the morning would resolve, she had written 3 words that nobody had seen yet. 3 words that, when they surfaced, would mean the morning was not as finished as it appeared. Svek saw it first. His phone had been pulling the communications queue from the Hollis Avenue Operations Center on a 15-minute refresh, routine monitoring, the kind of background function that ran whether or not there was anything worth monitoring. He'd been doing it for 11 years. Most days it produced nothing of consequence. He looked at his screen and went very still. Massimo. Massimo was looking out the window. The city was coming back around them as Kerr drove. The trees thinning, the streets widening, the ordinary density of the city reasserting itself after the particular remove of the hillside estate. What? Svek handed him the phone without speaking. The message thread was from the communications intercept system, the automated flag that Borik's team had set up 3 days ago on all outbound traffic from devices connected to the Vescari operational network. Celeste's phone had been added to the flag list when Massimo had handed it to Svek 2 days ago, not because he believed she was the source, but because elimination required inclusion. The flagged message had been sent at 9:47 a.m., while Massimo was sitting in the dining room listening to Seraphine dismantle 12 years of his life section by section. It had been sent to a number that the system had flagged as unknown, not unrecognized, not unregistered, but actively scrubbed, the kind of number that had been deliberately cleaned from every directory it had ever appeared in. The message was 3 words. It's done. Leave. Massimo read the message twice. The car moved through the city, and he sat with the phone in his hand and he read the 3 words a third time and felt something shift in the architecture of the morning that had nothing to do with the commission or the estate or Seraphine. It's done. Leave. Not a question, not a check-in, a confirmation, the specific grammar of someone telling a person waiting on a result that the result had arrived and they should now execute the next part of a plan. The number, Massimo said. Borik's running it now, Svek said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone managing the delivery of information they haven't finished processing themselves. It's not going to resolve to anything clean. That kind of scrub is professional. How long has she had it? In her contacts. At least 8 months based on the communication logs we pulled from the device audit. Svek took the phone back. There are prior messages, 16 of them, going back to March of last year. The content is, they're careful, nothing explicit, meeting confirmations mostly, status checks. He paused. The language pattern across all of them is consistent with a handler relationship. The word landed in the car and took up all the available space. Handler, not a personal contact, not a business relationship. The specific dynamic of someone receiving operational direction from a controlling party. Massimo looked at the back of Kerr's headrest and thought about Celeste standing at the window of the Meridian suite 2 days ago, saying maybe someone inside is leaking and holding his gaze with injured eyes when he asked for her phone. She had handed it over without hesitation, because she had known the messages were clean, because whatever device she used for the flagged number was not the phone she handed him. She had 2 phones, the way people in this world sometimes had 2 phones, and he had not considered it because he had not been considering her as a variable of that kind. He had been considering her as a personal failure, a lapse in judgment, a private humiliation wrapped inside a professional one. He had not been considering her as an operation. "Who does she work for?" he said. "We don't know yet. The scrub on that number is significant. Whoever set it up had resources and time." Svek was typing on his phone with one thumb, sending instructions to Borik. "But the timing of the message is, it's done. Leave." Massimo said it aloud this time, slowly, parsing each word. At 9:47. The commission session was still running at 9:47. The finding hadn't been announced. He turned to look at Svek directly. She knew the outcome before Prest announced it. Svek met his eyes. "She had a source in the room," he said. "Or she already knew the outcome because she was part of the process that produced it." Massimo's voice was entirely flat, the flatness of someone past the register of anger into something colder and more structural. Not Seraphine's side. Something else. Something that wanted this outcome and used everything available to get it. Svek said nothing. Massimo said, "Where is she now?" "The hotel suite was vacated this morning. Checkout was processed at 8:15. She was already gone before the session ended." "Yes." "And the accounts she was trying to access this morning?" "Still locked. The authorization error is still active." Massimo looked out the window. The city moved past in its ordinary way, entirely unaware of the specific recalibration happening in the back of a car moving through its morning traffic. People on sidewalks. Delivery vehicles. A woman walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something at the base of a lamppost with the focused dedication of a creature for whom the lamppost was the entire world. He thought about the architecture of the last 4 days. He had been watching Seraphine dismantle his operation, and he had understood it, eventually, as something she had built for herself. A reclamation, a rebalancing, the long and precise work of a woman taking back what was hers. He had understood it because it made sense given who she was. It was consistent with her methods and her intelligence and the 12 years he had spent watching her think. But there was another layer beneath that understanding that he had not looked at closely enough. Who benefits? It was the question he had been trained from his earliest years in this world to ask before any other question, and he had failed to ask it about his own situation because he had been too occupied with the personal scale of it, the humiliation of it, the recognition of everything he had failed to see. Seraphine benefited. She had taken the organization, but the organization had been disrupted in the process. Accounts frozen, shipments rerouted, political relationships severed. These were not conditions that strengthened the Vescari operation. They were conditions that made it temporarily vulnerable. And a temporarily vulnerable major Eastern organization was a specific kind of opportunity for specific kinds of interests. The question was which interests? And the answer to that question was standing somewhere in the city right now, having vacated a hotel suite at 8:15 a.m. with a phone he'd never seen in 16 months of operational communication with a scrubbed number that Borak was currently unable to resolve. "Find her," Massimo said. "We're looking." Not the way we looked for Seraphine. Celeste travels differently. She travels like someone who expects to be comfortable. She's not going to a warehouse on Carver Street. She's going to an airport or a hotel or somewhere that has room service and good lighting. He thought for a moment. She has cards, not the operational account, personal ones. Find the personal ones and run the transactions from this morning. Svek was already on it. Massimo said to Kerr, "Stop the car." Kerr pulled to the curb. Massimo got out. He stood on the sidewalk in the morning air and looked up at the sky, which was the same overcast gray it had been all morning, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, and he let himself understand the full shape of the last 4 days without flinching from any part of it. He had been moved. That was the word for it. Not manipulated, not deceived in the simple sense. Moved, the way a piece is moved on a board, repositioned from one square to another by a set of forces he hadn't fully identified. Seraphine's move had been real. Her documentation, her petition, her 12 years of quiet architecture, all of it was genuine, all of it was hers, and the Commission's finding was legitimate, and everything she had built had been built by her for reasons that were entirely her own. But someone had been watching that process. Someone had inserted Celeste into his life at a specific time and for specific reasons, and had been monitoring the progress of Seraphine's reclamation project from the inside, waiting for the moment of maximum disruption, the window when the Vescari organization was between leadership structures and its political protections were severed and its financial architecture was in transition. That window was now. He had walked out of his own estate an hour ago, having cooperated fully with a commission proceeding, and the organization was in Seraphine's hands for a 60-day review, and its defenses were at their lowest point in 14 years. And somewhere in the city, Celeste Vaughn was sending a 3-word message to a scrubbed number and checking out of a hotel. He pulled out his phone. Not to call Svek. He called Borak directly. "I need you to suspend the Celeste investigation and redirect everything to the number she messaged this morning," he said when Borak answered. "The number is the thread. Pull everything you have on organized interests that have been positioning around the Eastern structure in the last 18 months. New money, new movement. Anyone who's been building toward a presence in territory the Vescari operation controls." He paused. "And I need you to contact someone at the estate." The estate. Seraphine. A silence on Borak's end that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that this was an unusual request, and that Borak was smart enough not to say so. "I'll send the contact," Borak said. "No. I'll contact her myself. I need the documentation that was presented to the Commission this morning, specifically the section on political contacts and the regulatory relationships. I need to know if any of the contacts she identified had prior relationships with external interests that weren't Vescari aligned." You think the contacts were already compromised before she cut them off. I think someone made sure they'd go silent at exactly the right moment. I don't know yet if that was Seraphine's move or someone else's. He looked at the street. I need to know the difference. He ended the call. Svek had gotten out of the car and was standing a few feet away, reading his screen. Transaction hit, Svek said. Card ending in 4471. Personal visa registered to a Celeste Moreau, not Vaughn, different name. Transaction at 10:23 a.m. at the Karsten Hotel downtown. Car service charge. She's moving. Car service logs show a pickup at the Karsten at 10:40. Destination, the private terminal at Halford Field. Private terminal. Not the commercial airport. The terminal used by charter operations, corporate flights, the kind of travel that didn't generate the same paper trail as a ticket purchase. Massimo looked at his watch. 10:40 pickup. Halford Field was 25 minutes from downtown in light traffic. It was currently 11:08. How long to the private terminal, he said. 15 minutes from here, Kerr said from beside the car. Massimo looked at Svek. Svek said, if she's on the ground at Halford, she hasn't taken off yet. Charter prep takes at minimum 30 minutes, usually more. They had a window. Massimo got back in the car. Halford Field, he said. Private terminal entrance. Kerr pulled into traffic. Massimo sat in the back and called the number he had for Seraphine, the same number he'd called 4 days ago when she'd picked up and said nothing and closed the line. He did not know if it was still active. He did not know if she would answer. She answered on the third ring. I know, she said before he could speak. He stopped. About Celeste, he said. I've known about her since month 4, Seraphine said. Her voice had the same quality it had had in the corridor of the estate, the exhaustion of something set down, but alert underneath it. Not who she was working for, that I didn't know. Why didn't you? Because I didn't know what she was, specifically. I knew she wasn't simply a woman you chose. The pattern of the introduction was too deliberate. The timing aligned too precisely with a period of increased external interest in Eastern territory. A pause. I flagged it as a possible variable in the original architecture, but I couldn't build a response to something I couldn't fully identify. She messaged someone this morning when the commission session was still running. It's done. Leave. Silence. She had a source, Seraphine said. Or she was the source. She was in the building this morning. I left her at the Meridian. She was still there when I left for the estate. If the suite was wired, the commission session would have been accessible, Seraphine said. The estate's main rooms are clean. I had them swept before the principals arrived. But the Meridian is a hotel we've been using for 4 days and nobody swept. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the silence of two people on opposite sides of something. The silence of two people looking at the same problem from close range. She's at Halford Field, Massimo said. Private terminal. I have maybe 20 minutes before she's in the air. You're going there? Yes. Another silence. Massimo. Her voice was careful. Whatever she is, whoever she works for, if you move against her without knowing the full picture, you may be reaching into something you can't see the edges of. I'm not going to move against her, he said. I'm going to talk to her. In a private terminal. I'm suspended, Seraphine, not incompetent. He watched the buildings moving past the window. I need to know who's behind her, because whoever it is has been watching your process from the inside and is positioned to move against the organization right now, during the review period, when the defenses are restructured and the political contacts are severed and the financial architecture is in your hands instead of anyone's who's prepared to use it as a weapon. A long pause. The review window, she said quietly. 60 days. 60 cab. You negotiated 60 days and whoever this is helped make that happen. Because 60 days of transition is 60 days of exposure, and they've been building toward exactly this. He could hear her thinking, could hear the specific quality of her silence when she was running something forward to its consequences. What do you need? She said. I need you to freeze every outbound transfer capable from the Castellan architecture for the next 4 hours. Nothing moves, not a cent. If someone is positioned to exploit the transition, their first move will be financial. That will also freeze the Commission's own review access temporarily. I know. Call press. Tell him it's a security precaution. He'll understand. She was quiet for a moment. And if I do this, she said, and you come back from Halford Field with information that changes the shape of the last 4 days. What then? He thought about the corridor, her voice saying, "I did it because," and him saying, "I know," before she could finish. "Then we figure out what then," he said. "But right now the organization is exposed, and you're the only person who can close the architecture fast enough to matter." The line was quiet. Then, "The architecture will be closed in 8 minutes. Thank you." He ended the call. The car was moving fast through the city now, Kerr having found a route that bypassed the worst of the mid-morning congestion, and the private terminal at Halford Field was coming up on the navigation screen as a blue marker 7 minutes ahead. Massimo sat forward in the seat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely together, and he looked at the road ahead and thought about Celeste Vaughn standing at the window of the Meridian Suite with that specific quality of attention that he had read as good instincts and had not read far enough. 7 minutes. Whatever she knew, whatever name was behind the scrubbed number, whatever operation had inserted her into his life 16 months ago and had been monitoring Seraphine's moves and waiting for the commission session to conclude, it was sitting in a car ahead of him on the way to a private terminal. And Massimo Vescari, stripped of his title and his authority, and his captains, and most of the architecture of the life he had built, had exactly one thing left that had always been entirely his own. He knew how to walk into a room and make someone understand that they were going to answer his questions. The terminal entrance came into view. Kerr turned in without being told. The private terminal at Halford Field was small by design. That was the point of it. No public concourse, no check-in lines, no crowds of people moving through with rolling luggage, and the specific glazed forward focus of commercial travelers. Just a low building of glass and brushed steel, a lounge inside with leather chairs and a bar that opened at 10, and beyond it a tarmac where 3 charter aircraft were currently positioned at various stages of preparation. Massimo walked through the entrance at 11:19 a.m. The woman at the reception desk looked up and read his face and made the calculation that most people made when they looked at him, that the path of least resistance was to let him do whatever he had come to do, and looked back down at her screen without speaking. He scanned the lounge. Celeste was at the far end near the window that faced the tarmac. She had a carry-on bag at her feet and a coffee she wasn't drinking and her phone in her hand, and she was looking at the phone when he walked in, and she did not look up immediately, and in the 2 seconds before she registered him, he had time to look at her the way you look at something when you finally know what you're looking at. She was composed. That was the first thing. Whatever was moving in her, she had it dressed and presented and controlled. The red dress was gone. She wore something dark and simple, travel clothes, nothing that would be remembered. And her hair was pulled back and she looked like someone waiting for a flight, which she was, and like someone without anything particular on her conscience, which she was not. She looked up. Found him. Something moved across her face very quickly and was then controlled with the speed of someone who had trained the control. She did not run. He noted this. Running would have told him something. Not running told him something else. That she had assessed the situation in the moment of recognition and concluded that running was the worst option, which meant she was still thinking tactically, which meant she still believed she had something to work with. He walked to her table and sat down across from her without being invited. She set the phone face down on the table. "How long?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "How long what?" "Don't." His voice was even. Not loud, not threatening in the performed sense. Just final. "We're in a public building, and I'm a man whose authority was formally suspended 2 hours ago, and I have no particular leverage over you in any institutional sense. So you could stand up and walk to that plane, and I couldn't stop you." He held her gaze. "But you're not standing up, so talk to me." A long moment. Celeste picked up the coffee she hadn't been drinking, took a small sip, set it back down. 16 months, she said. He said nothing, let her continue. "I was approached 16 months ago. By a man I'd done work for before, not this kind of work, earlier. He knew my background, knew what I could do. He made an offer." She kept her eyes on the coffee cup. "The offer was to get close to you, report on the internal situation, the relationship with your wife, the state of the organization, who the key people were, and what their loyalties looked like." She paused. "I wasn't asked to do anything to the organization, just observe and report." And the message this morning, Her jaw tightened slightly. That was a check-in. My handler wanted confirmation that the commission session had concluded. It's done. Leave. He said it flat. That's a check-in. The wording was his. He had specific language for specific outcomes. She looked up from the coffee. I didn't know, when I got into this, that it would go where it went. I thought... She stopped. I thought it was an information job. 6 months, maybe 8. Get in, observe, exit, clean. You thought you were doing intelligence work. I was doing intelligence work. You were positioned inside my household during a period when the most significant restructuring of my organization in 14 years was being engineered, and you were reporting its progress to someone with a vested interest in the outcome. He leaned forward slightly. That's not intelligence work. That's a component of an operation. You were a part of something larger than what you were told about. She looked at him and said nothing, and in her silence he read the thing that people reveal when they stop performing, a version of what he recognized because he had felt it himself 2 hours ago in the dining room of the estate. The specific unease of understanding that you have been inside something whose full shape you didn't know. Who is he? Massimo said. I don't know his real name. What name did you use? She hesitated. Celeste, he said, quietly. The Castellan architecture was closed 40 minutes ago. Every financial instrument connected to the Vescari operation is frozen. Whatever was supposed to happen during the transition window that my wife's commission proceeding created, it's not happening. Your handler is sitting somewhere right now looking at frozen accounts and blocked access, and he is not having a good morning. He paused. Whoever he is, whatever organization he represents, they have lost their window. That window was specific. It required the transition period, the severed political contacts, the restructured financial architecture. All of it closed. He held her gaze. What he has left is you, and you are sitting in a private terminal talking to me. So the name. She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were on the table now, not in her lap, and they were not entirely steady. That was the first crack in the composure. The hands, and he watched it because hands were honest. Renard, she said finally. He used the name Renard. What? Borak had the name resolved in 40 minutes. Massimo sat in the terminal lounge with Celeste across from him, and neither of them went anywhere while Borak worked, because she understood by now that leaving was not the option she had assessed it to be, and because Massimo had no particular desire to be anywhere else until he had the full picture. Renard was not a name in any public record, but the methods, the communication structure, the scrub architecture on the phone number, the specific tradecraft of the insertion operation matched a pattern Borak's team identified from 2 previous incidents in the European Eastern structure, an operation that had successfully destabilized 2 mid-level organizations in the Baltic corridor over the previous 3 years using similar methods. An intermediary operation, not a family in the traditional sense. A group that identified transition moments in established organizations and moved into the resulting instability. They didn't take over directly. They created conditions that allowed them to move in as a stabilizing force, which meant arriving with resources and relationships in the aftermath of a disruption they had engineered, offering to fill the gaps that the disruption had created, extracting operational control in exchange for the appearance of rescue. They needed a window. The commission proceeding had been the window. Massimo read Borak's summary on Svek's phone and felt the cold precision of it. The Renard operation had not opposed Seraphine's move against him. They had let it run, had perhaps helped it run in certain specific ways. The regulatory contacts going silent at exactly the right moment was a detail that bore looking at, because the outcome they needed was not Massimo's removal specifically. It was the transition period, the 60-day review. A major Eastern organization in administrative flux, its defenses reoriented, its political protections severed, its financial architecture in the hands of someone whose attention would be consumed by the commission review process. 60 days to move in, establish footholds, build dependencies. And when the review ended and the organization stabilized, they would be inside it. He sent Borak 2 instructions. First, transmit the full Renard operational profile to Seraphine immediately. Second, Copy it to the Commission Secretariat with a formal notation that the petition proceeding had been partially facilitated by an external interference operation and that the Commission's own review process had been used as a tool. That second instruction was the one that mattered most. The Commission did not tolerate being used. That was the foundational principle of its authority. The neutrality was real, was protected, was enforced with a consistency that had outlasted every individual family that had ever tried to circumvent it. If someone had manipulated the Commission proceeding, the Commission's response would be structural and severe, and would have nothing to do with Massimo's personal situation. He handed the phone back to Svek and looked at Celeste. Your handler is going to know within the hour that the window is closed and that his operation has been identified, he said. Whatever he told you about extraction, about the exit plan for when the job ended, I'd evaluate that carefully. She looked at him and said nothing. People who run operations of this kind, he said, typically have very efficient protocols for closing loose threads when a job goes wrong. Her hands on the table went still in the way that things go still when they stop pretending. What do you want? She said. I want written documentation of every communication you had with Renard or any representative of his operation, every message, every meeting, every instruction, everything you observed and reported. He paused. In exchange, you leave this terminal on that plane and go wherever you were planning to go, and the Vescari organization takes no action against you personally. She looked at him. That's it, she said. That's it. You're not... She stopped, reassessing. You don't have authority anymore. No, he said, but she does. And I'm going to recommend she honor this arrangement, and she is going to honor it, because the documentation is more valuable to her than you are. He held Celeste's gaze steadily. I know you have the communication logs. You kept them, because people in your position always keep them. Insurance, in case the handler decides you're a loose thread. A long pause. Her hand moved to her bag. She unzipped an interior pocket and removed a small drive. She set it on the table between them. He picked it up and held it and looked at her. The account you were trying to access this morning, he said. The one showing the authorization error. There's approximately 40,000 in it, operational funds that accumulated over the time you were in position. He paused. I'm going to ask that the authorization error be cleared. Whatever's in that account is yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said. And it was a genuine question, not a tactical one. The voice of someone who had spent 16 months in a world of transactional logic and was encountering something that didn't fit the model. He thought about how to answer it. Because you were used, he said finally. Not cleanly. Whoever Renard is, he told you this was an observation job, and he put you in the middle of something that had consequences you weren't fully informed about. That's not loyalty. That's expendable. He stood up. I've spent 14 years making people expendable. I recognize the architecture. He left the drive with Svek and walked out of the terminal. The call to Seraphine lasted 11 minutes. He stood outside the terminal in the gray morning air and walked her through all of it. Celeste, the Renard operation, the window strategy, the commission proceeding as a vehicle. She listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened, and he could hear in her silence the specific quality of her processing it, running it forward, identifying the implications. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The regulatory contacts, she said. 2 of them. I thought their silence was responsive to the documentation I sent them, a preemptive withdrawal to avoid being named. A pause. But if Renard's operation had already made contact with them? They were already turned, he said, or at minimum approached. The silence wasn't about you, it was about clearing the path. Which means the commission proceeding had a cleaner run than it should have. She stopped. Parts of it. The finding is still legitimate, he said. The documentation is real. The violations are real. I'm not disputing any of it. A silence. I know, she said. But the proceeding was assisted. Someone made sure the friction points were removed. I think you should tell Prest. I intend to. A pause. The drive. Svek has it. I'll have it sent to you within the hour. And Celeste. She gave us everything she had. Let her go. Seraphine was quiet for long enough that he counted 5 seconds. All right, she said. He looked at the sky. Same overcast gray. The morning felt like it had been running for approximately 3 years. The Linzer account, he said. I meant what I said. Use it for the review, whatever the organization needs. Massimo. Her voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, exactly. More precise, in the way that precision sometimes functions as gentleness. The Linzer account has your mother's name on the secondary designation. I'm not touching it. He said nothing. It was for her, Seraphine said. You set it up 2 years after she was diagnosed. I found it in year 4 and I left it alone because it was yours and it was private and it had nothing to do with anything I was building. A pause. She passed 18 months ago. The account has been sitting there since. I'm not touching it. The line was quiet. He pressed 2 fingers to his eyes and held them there. Thank you, he said. His voice came out slightly different than he intended. He didn't correct it. The organization will be stable in 60 days, Seraphine said. Whatever comes after that, the commission will have a recommendation. I'll have a recommendation. She paused. I don't know what role, if any, makes sense for you in the structure going forward. That's not something I can answer today. I'm not asking, he said. I know you're not. I'm telling you it's not closed. She stopped. You called me this morning when you didn't have to. You closed the architecture when you could have let whatever Renard had planned run and used the chaos to make a case for your own reinstatement. Another pause. You didn't. No. That's noted, she said. That's all I'm saying. He took his fingers away from his eyes and looked at the tarmac where a small charter aircraft was beginning to move. Celeste's flight. He watched it taxi toward the runway. The airplane was unremarkable. White, standard charter configuration, already anonymous in the flat gray light. It reached the runway threshold, paused, then accelerated and lifted and became smaller and was gone into the overcast before he could have said exactly when it crossed from visible to not. He watched the empty sky for a moment. Then he said, Seraphine. Yes. The Tuesday, 3 years ago, when I took the call. A silence. I remember it, she said. I know. He breathed out. I'm not asking you to. I'm not making a case. He stopped. I'm sorry I took the call. The silence on the line had a texture to it that he couldn't name precisely. Not warm, not cold. Something that had been held at distance for a long time, carefully and deliberately recognizing itself. I know, she said finally, and that was all. But it was the right kind of all. The kind that doesn't need more words around it, because the words would only reduce it. The line stayed open for another few seconds. Then it closed. The weeks that followed had a quality that Massimo had not experienced in his adult life. Quiet. Not the quiet of a held breath. Not the strategic quiet of someone waiting for the right moment. Actual quiet. The kind that doesn't require management. He took an apartment on the west side of the city. Not modest in the self-punishing sense. He was not a man who believed in self-punishment, had always found it a self-indulgent waste of productive capacity, but smaller than anything he had occupied in 14 years. 4 rooms. A window that faced the river. A kitchen he had not expected to use and began using in the second week because it turned out that the mechanical process of cooking was one of the few activities that required enough attention to occupy the thinking parts of his mind without generating any new problems. He was not under commission restriction in terms of movement or activity. He had cooperated fully, had provided the Renard documentation, had vacated the organizational role without contest. The commission had no interest in punishing him further. They were institutional, not personal. He had violated codes and been relieved of authority, and that was the end of the commission's interest in him. The Renard situation resolved faster than he expected. Borak, who continued to work, now for the organization under Seraphine's administration, but who sent Massimo periodic updates as a professional courtesy that nobody formally authorized and nobody formally objected to, reported that Renard's operation had withdrawn from the Eastern Territory within 2 weeks of the window closing. The pattern was consistent with the Baltic incidents. When the window closed, they didn't fight. They simply moved elsewhere, began identifying the next transition moment, the next organization in flux. The commission opened an investigation into the regulatory contacts who had gone silent. 2 of them resigned from their positions before the investigation concluded. One cooperated with the commission's inquiry and provided information about the Reynard operations outreach methods that Seraphine subsequently transmitted to law enforcement channels where it could do the most institutional damage. Nobody found Reynard himself. This was expected. The name was operational, the structure was distributed, and the people at its center had been doing this long enough to understand that the most durable form of protection was never quite being present when the accounting arrived. Massimo noted this without particular frustration. He had spent 14 years at the center of a structure that was not fully visible, and he understood better than most that visibility was a choice the powerful made only when it served them. Aldrich Fenn called him on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week. "I have bread that turned out well," Fenn said, "and I think it would be wasted on just me. Come for coffee." Massimo went. They sat in Fenn's kitchen with the bread and the coffee and the tomato plants visible through the window, growing badly, as they always did, because Fenn's commitment to them was emotional rather than horticultural. Fenn did not say anything for a while. He broke a piece of bread and ate it and looked at the tomatoes. "She came to see me last week," he said finally. "I know," Massimo said. Borak's update. "She wanted to make sure I was all right." After the Fenn gestured vaguely, encompassing the fact of having been held in a facility in the South Side for 2 days. "I told her I was fine. I was fine. The men who held me were remarkably polite, given the circumstances. I told them to be." "I know you did." Fenn looked at him. "That was a choice you made when you were under considerable pressure. I noted it." He broke another piece of bread. "She noted it too." Massimo drank his coffee and said nothing. "She's good at this," Fenn said. "The administration, the structural work. She was always good at it, but she was good at it for someone else's benefit, and that creates a particular kind of friction that you don't notice until it's gone." He paused. "She's working without friction now. It's different." "I know." "Does that bother you?" Massimo thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said. And it was true, which surprised him slightly, because he had expected it to bother him, had prepared for it to bother him in the weeks of his apartment and his river window and his unexpected kitchen, and it had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something smaller and quieter, a recognition, not comfortable, but not unbearable, that the thing he had lost had not entirely been his in the ways he had believed it was his. The title, the authority, the architecture of consequence that he had moved through for 14 years believing was a product of himself. Some of it had been him. He was honest enough to know that. The fear he had generated was real, and the loyalty it had purchased was real, and the results it had produced were real. But the foundation had always been shared. He simply hadn't been willing to look at it. "I made her invisible," he said. It was not an accusation of himself exactly, more the naming of a fact that had been in the room for a long time without a name. "Not deliberately, not out of cruelty, she fit so precisely into the structure around me that I stopped seeing her as separate from it, like asking someone to look at the frame of a painting." Fenn was quiet. "She knew that," Fenn said. "I know she knew it. She stayed anyway." "I know." "For a long time," Fenn said. "I know that too." They sat with it. Outside, the tomatoes grew badly in the late morning light. The commission's 60-day review concluded on a Thursday. Seraphine presented the structural compliance report to the full commission panel, all 14 families represented, the first full attendance in 6 years, and the report ran to 300 pages and contained, among other things, a complete redesign of the authorization architecture, a new protocol for internal dispute resolution that reduced the likelihood of the kind of code violations that had generated the original petition, and a framework for commission oversight that gave the external body visibility into the organization's key decisions without giving it operational control. Prest read it over 2 days and told her it was the most comprehensive compliance submission the commission had ever received. She said, "It needed to be." The The commission voted to restore the Vescari organization's full operational status under the new structure. They also voted, for the first time in commission history, to formally recognize the administrative head of a member organization by name in their public record, a distinction that had no operational function but that carried a weight in this world that everyone present understood. Seraphine Vale, architect of record. Marco Della Rosa, when the vote concluded, said to the room, "This was handled the way things should be handled. I hope we all remember that." Nobody argued. What? Massimo heard about the vote from Borak, who texted him a single line. Full restoration, full recognition. She pulled it off clean. He sat with the phone in the apartment by the river window, and the city moved below him in its ordinary way, and he felt something that was not pride, exactly, because pride implied ownership, and he had no claim to this. It was something more like recognition, the specific satisfaction of watching something work the way it was supposed to work, finally and fully, in the way it had always been capable of working if it had been given the conditions it needed. He set the phone down. He did not text back. Some responses don't require a word. 3 months after the gala, on a quiet evening when the city was doing what it always did, and the river below his window was going wherever rivers went in the dark, Seraphine came to the apartment. He had not known she was coming. She knocked, which was something, and he opened the door and she stood in the hallway in a coat he didn't recognize, new, something she'd bought after, something that had nothing of the estate or the 12 years in it. And she looked at him the way she had looked at him in the corridor of the estate, with the exhaustion that had become something else. He stepped back from the door. She came in. She looked at the apartment without commenting on it, looked at the kitchen, the window, the river visible in the dark below. She stood at the window for a moment the way you stand at a window when you're thinking something that's almost ready to be said. The Reynard operation moved on a target in the Gulf Coast territory last month, she said. The commission is tracking it. I gave them everything from the drive. Borak told me. I know. She turned from the window. I wanted to tell you myself. He nodded. She looked at him with a directness that had always been one of the most specifically difficult things about her. The way she looked at things she was deciding, without performance, without management. I don't know what this is, she said. Not what we are. What this is. The specific, careful distinction of a woman who did not assume. Neither do I, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I want that to be clear. She held his gaze. I spent 12 years building something that wasn't acknowledged, and I learned some things about myself in the process. I'm not going back to invisible. I know. I mean it. Seraphine. He said her name the way he had said it in the corridor, without the armor it usually carried. I know. She looked at him. I made you invisible, he said. Not out of cruelty. Out of a blindness I can't undo. I can't give you back the 12 years. I can't revise what I was. He paused. I don't know what I'm capable of being now. I genuinely don't. I've spent 3 months in this apartment trying to find out, and I don't have a clean answer. She was quiet. That's honest, she said. It's all I have that's worth giving you at this point. She looked out the window at the river. He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she stood, the specific quality of her stillness that had always had more gravity in it than other people's motion. Come for dinner, she said finally. Not tonight. Next week. I'm cooking, which means it will actually be good, and we can talk without either of us having an agenda. She turned to look at him. Just dinner. He looked at her. Yes, he said. She nodded once. The same nod. And she picked up her coat from the chair where she'd set it and walked to the door. And at the door she paused for a moment with her hand on the frame, not turning back, not performing the pause, just occupying it the way you occupy a moment that has weight. And then she left, and the door closed behind her with the soft, complete sound of something settling into place. Massimo stood in the apartment. The city moved below the window. The river went where it was going. He stood there for a long time, not thinking or thinking in the way that doesn't produce sentences. Just standing in the room, in the quiet, in the specific quality of an evening that had no agenda and no architecture and nothing required of him except to be in it. After a while, he went to the kitchen. He had bread that needed finishing. He put it in the oven and set the timer and stood at the counter while the apartment filled slowly with the smell of something warm, and outside the city went on being what it was, vast and indifferent and full of people living their lives at whatever altitude they had managed to reach. And the river moved in the dark, and the timer ticked down, and the night was ordinary and quiet and entirely, simply his.